Literally the plot of Black Mirror Season 4, Episode 4. In May 2024, many responses to a tweet sound something like this. A tweet featuring a video of American entrepreneur Whitney Wolfe Herd, who happens to be the CEO of the dating platform Bumble.
If you want to get really out there, there is a world where your dating concierge could go and date for you with other dating concierge. Truly. And then you don't have to talk to 600 people. It will go scan all of San Francisco.
And indeed, she describes quite precisely what happens in the Black Mirror episode Hang the DJ. In that episode, the two characters Frank and Amy find themselves in an artificial world and, guided by a kind of app, try out various dating constellations with different people. In the final scene, the characters turn out to be digital avatars who, over the course of an endlessly long simulation, have come to the conclusion that the real Amy and the real Frank are compatible. In the comments that highlight the parallels between Herd's visions and the story of the episode, a sense of unease is expressed. Specifically, unease about how much reality now resembles the dystopian stories of science fiction. This isn't just about artificial intelligence. Self-driving cars, VR headsets, combat drones in the war between Ukraine and Russia, or the omnipresence of smartphones and the online sphere in everyday life also contribute to the feeling that we are living in the feverish future visions of past decades. These predictions have become so deeply embedded in the collective consciousness that even in personal conversations and debates about current political issues, people constantly refer back to them. For example, when protests against the restrictions of reproductive rights occur in the US, some demonstrators dress up as handmaids, alluding to Margaret Atwood's novel.
Great Britain's George Orwell warned us of the danger of this kind of information.
During the discussions surrounding Edward Snowden's revelations in the 2013 NSA scandal, references to Orwell, the novel 1984, Big Brother, or even Orwellian conditions had almost become clichés. The imagery of science fiction, then, shapes how we perceive the present. And that's no coincidence, but rather stems from characteristics and narrative techniques inherent to the genre. In high-quality science fiction narratives, a hypothetical or emerging technology is typically explored, along with its effects on society, the psyche, and culture. What is it like to live alongside android robots? What are the consequences of shifting life into the digital and virtual realm? Could a powerful quantum computer predict the future in a deterministic universe? Speculative fiction can explore such questions through a method that writer and theorist Dietmar Dart, in Nie Geschichte, his extensive compendium on the genre, calls negative induction. One derives chains of events from laws, which can be chosen almost arbitrarily but must then be followed, events that can be narrated. In other words, one arranges a chain of conclusions for the purpose of generating cause and effect narratives that are permissible within the framework of the postulated laws. Science fiction thus continually constructs future worlds in which possible events and developments are tested and elaborated, often on a scientific basis. Of course, this is neither the only nor the first way to look into the future. Long before it, there were things like oracles, religious prophecies, and political utopias. Science fiction has largely displaced these older forms of future anticipation. Alongside scientific and economic forecasting, it has become one of the central techniques for envisioning what lies ahead. This gives it, among all literary genres, the closest relationship to the development of real history. Since history itself, especially since the Industrial Revolution, has been shaped primarily by technological progress. Many science fiction stories are set in the very near future, which makes them in a specific sense verifiable once real history reaches the moment the story takes place. Blade Runner, a landmark cyberpunk film released in 1982, is set in November 2019. Octavia Butler's novel The Parable of the Sower, which deals with the consequences of climate change and massive social inequality, begins on July 20, 2024, and comes eerily close to the conditions we face today. On the internet, there are entire timelines showing where different stories are set throughout the 21st century and beyond. This interplay between forward-looking, exploratory fiction and lagging historical reality is increasingly moving into the spotlight. Yet what seems like a new phenomenon has long been part of science fiction. As early as the 19th century, speculative literature was intertwined with science and engineering. This is well illustrated by the works of the French science fiction pioneer Jules Verne. He was inspired by the Plongeur, one of the first submarines of the French Navy, when creating the famous Nautilus of Captain Nemo. In this case, reality served as the model for fiction. In 1957, the Nautilus also appeared in Walt Disney's Our Friend the Atom, an educational film about nuclear energy.
Not long ago, we brought you the immortal tale, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, featuring the famous submarine Nautilus. According to the story, this craft was powered by a magic force. Today, that tale has come true. This is a model of the real Nautilus, the world's first atom-powered ship.
This is a major misinterpretation of the original novel, in which the Nautilus is powered by sodium, which Captain Nemo extracts from the sea. Although Walt Disney gets it wrong, he is pointing to a central insight.
Fiction often has a way of becoming fact.
That sometimes fiction can also serve as a model for reality is illustrated much more clearly by the example of space travel using rockets. In 1865, Jules Verne publishes his novel De la Terre à la Lune, in which a kind of rocket with people in it is fired at the moon from a giant cannon. Through the book's illustrations and the 1902 film adaptation Voyage dans la Lune by Georges Méliès, space travel becomes visually and aesthetically tangible long before it's technically possible. Between Jules Verne's giant cannon and the first steps on the moon nearly a century later, there are people like the Russian author, rocket scientist and spaceflight pioneer Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who acts almost like a hinge between fiction and science. Tsiolkovsky is initially fascinated by Jules Verne and begins writing science fiction stories of his own. In fact, at the end of the 19th century, he too writes a story about a journey to the moon, Na Lune. But he doesn't stop at storytelling. He also begins to seriously consider how space travel could be physically possible, delving into scientific thought.
Оттолкнуться можно от любого предмета, от любого вещества, имеющего вес, массу. Вот мы сейчас неподвижны. Теперь смотри. Я отталкиваюсь от весла. Ать! От другого. Что вы делаете? От якоря. От скамейки. От ведра. От зонта. Константин Эдуардович, ну, мы едем или нет? Едем. Еще как едем. Ну вот.
The principle of expelling reaction mass in a specific direction to propel oneself through the vacuum of space leads Tsiolkovsky to the rocket equation. This equation became the foundation for Robert Goddard's first rocket tests and remains the cornerstone of rocket-powered space travel today. One can thus draw a direct line from Jules Verne through visionary Konstantin Tsiolkovsky and engineer Robert Goddard to Wernher von Braun and ultimately to the Apollo mission to the Moon. Scientific development and speculative fiction form a mutually reinforcing interplay. On the one hand, fiction extrapolates real-world science into the future. On the other hand, the imaginative spaces and visual worlds that emerge influence the very technologies taking shape. Yet not every science fiction fantasy is ennobled by becoming reality. Some remain mere fantasies. But even as failed dreams of the future, these fictions shape the collective consciousness. In 1981, author William Gibson published a short story titled The Gernsback Continuum. It follows a photographer tasked with documenting the architectural relics of 1930s streamline modernity. Futuristic-looking gas stations and diners, or buildings like the Johnson Wax headquarters in Wisconsin. Think of it, says the woman who gives him the assignment, as a kind of alternate America. A 1980 that never happened, an architecture of broken dreams. Such broken dreams can be found, for instance, in the designs of locomotives, ocean liners, or entire futuristic cities by designers like Norman Bell Geddes or Raymond Loewy in the 1930s. In this aesthetic, the future becomes a kind of technological promise of salvation, a sleek, streamlined perfection. When the photographer in Gibson's story begins hallucinating and sees the fantastical future machines of the 1930s in the American desert, he seeks advice from journalist Merv Keane, who interprets the hallucinations as a semiotic ghost. If you want a classier explanation, I'd say you saw a semiotic ghost. All these contactee stories, for instance, are framed in a kind of science fiction imagery that permeates our culture. I could buy aliens, but not aliens that look like 50s comic art. They are semiotic phantoms, bits of deep cultural imagery that have split off and taken on a life of their own. The old visual worlds of the future shape the present. And precisely because these visual worlds are so pervasive, corporations and capital interests make use of these semiotic ghosts. Just like director Ridley Scott, who in 1984 directed a commercial for Apple's Macintosh that only makes sense if you know the semiotic ghost of Orwell's novel.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Companies that flirt with the aesthetics of science fiction sometimes find themselves in serious conflict with the artists who helped shape that very aesthetic. For example, Alex Poyros, the artistic director of the film I, Robot, accused Tesla CEO Elon Musk of idea theft. William Gibson not only wrote the Gernsback Continuum, he was also a pioneer of a new, darker variant of science fiction. In cyberpunk, industrial modernity has subjugated the organic, and people dwell in monstrous cities, their lives dominated by dehumanizing technology and overpowering corporations. From that point on, science fiction becomes less of a promise and more of a warning. The atomic bomb, financial crises, and climate change have not left it unmarked. The relationship between science fiction and modernity is perhaps best captured by a parable from the writer Walter Benjamin. In the 9th of his thesis on history, he discusses a painting by Paul Klee, Angelus Novus. In Benjamin's interpretation, the painting shows an angel being blown backwards, away from the viewer, with its wings spread wide. Benjamin writes, "This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned toward the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it at his feet. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm is what we call progress." If we continue with this image, then science fiction is the literary attempt of the angel to turn around and catch a glimpse of the terrain into which he is being blown, the realm of future possibilities. And in doing so, he occasionally recognizes in the growing pile of rubble before him, in our present and the past few decades, fragments of what he has already glimpsed over his shoulder. In this way, a kind of collective déjà vu emerges in historical moments when we recognize our old predictions in the present.